So we figured that we would do a video a little bit about the state of the hobby and how headphones have really changed over the years. We've been doing this for a long time, and the options that were available and the path that we took getting into this space was very different from how we would advocate for getting into headphones today. So I have with me here today Caleb and Griffin, and that's what we're going to talk about. Let's get going with the video. Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind with all of this is the products have gotten a lot better. We talk a lot about how audio as a hobby, it doesn't evolve the same way that other industries do, because there are timeless products or products that have always been great that are still great today, but it has progressed quite a bit, and what's available today has dramatically improved. And we've also seen a lot more competence and well-tuned stuff start to come out at more affordable and accessible price points. So I think a lot has changed. But maybe we should take a look back and just sort of consider what was available to us when we first got into it, and maybe some of the mistakes that we made, getting into this stuff early on, and how we would do things differently.
Yeah, so it really depends on how far back we're going. Like I made my Headphone account in 2011, I think. And if I go that far back, I mean, pickings were slim, man. There was basically no science to speak of when it came to what would be an ideal sound profile for an IEM. And then headphones, I think in 2011, most of the data out there was from Tile. Things that we knew sounded good, like the HG600 or 650 looked good, but it was kind of hard to use that data to indicate much beyond the things we already knew were good. If I were getting into it back then, I would have had a pretty hard time. Now, if we instead are talking about 2020, which is when I did get back into this place and kind of where my current era started, I think then there were a lot more decent options. It really would have been down to how well I know my own preferences. And I'm gonna be real, at that point, I didn't as well as I do now. And you talked about how the products are getting better over time. I can't help but think we as listeners and consumers, and I'm not just talking about us three, but the wider consumer base, audiophile consumer base, has gotten a lot more familiar with what their actual preference is. So if I were coming into this in 2020, I think the biggest challenge for me would actually be not listening to other people. I was one of those people who's just online voraciously consuming reviews and impressions to find out what's good. And it turned out that most of the stuff people said was good was not actually that good for me. So I think the biggest challenge would have been not caring so much about that stuff and really just focusing on trying stuff myself and taking notes and becoming more familiar with what I actually like. I do think even at that point I was using EQ, so that would probably hasten the process to ultimately identifying what that is. But yeah, I think if I were plopped back into 2020, I would have gone about it quite differently. Instead of being this super active community member, reading a lot of reviews and watching a lot of content, I probably would have been a little bit more solitary about it and just played around with EQ, trying to figure out what I actually liked.
What you said there is really important. I would approach both what people just say online about products and the data, the graphs, with a lot more skepticism, and I would hedge against that stuff a lot more than I did at the time. Back then, when you would look at a graph, you would be like, okay, that's the performance of this product. That is what this product is. And we've learned so much about how these devices change depending on, the head and the ear that they're placed on, and also just how, very variable people's preferences are, to the degree that when you just read a person's impressions online, you cannot have confidence that that is remotely how it's going to be for you. And I would add a much stronger helping of salt to any impressions and reviews that I would consume, to the point where now it's actually, in a way, having all this knowledge, and I think the community has a lot of this knowledge too, it is really challenging to get a perspective on how something's going to sound without trying it yourself. And that is literally the project that we are, all trying to participate in, right? We're trying to help people, guide people to better experiences with their music, and it's not an easy thing to do. If anything, it's gotten more complicated the more that we've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started my time in the hobby, this was probably back in 2018, something like that. For context, My very first headphone was the Audio-Technica A900X, my very first IEM, and that was the one that really kicked me off in the hobby, was the good old Tin Audio T2. The Audio-Technica A900X, shout out to Meadow571 for, it was his review that really got me into the hobby. I was on a vacation to Japan, visited earphone, and I was like, I have to leave with a headphone if I'm in Japan. And it was one of those Fostex TH00s. There was clearly some deficiencies with them that, you could tell. And I think it was because of those deficiencies that I started getting into reviewing, right? I got into reviewing because I wanted to write about some of the deficiencies that I thought they were in there, but some of the things that were also good about it, and just, put my thoughts out there in the world. And lo and behold, I started getting into more reviewing. I think if I were to redo it today, I think with how good products have started to become nowadays and how much information over the years that reviewers have sort of worked through and manufacturers have also worked through and learned, to be honest, I'm not sure if I would get into reviewing as much as I did in the past, simply because that I probably would have picked something up and I'd be like, yeah, this is good enough, and I would have went on with my day, right? When we talk about measurements and that sort of thing, in a way, for me, it hasn't actually changed that much. The quality of measurements and the community understanding around measurements has certainly gotten a lot better, but from my perspective, I've always taken measurements as a bit of a keeping the reviewer honest, or relatively honest, rather than seeing it as the performance of the headphone and then the reviewer's thoughts has to sort of line up to it or, work around it, right? The reason for that is because, I don't know, I just feel like whenever I look at a graph, I think about how many missteps that can go into creating a graph, and so I don't even want to think about it at all. But I should also caveat all of that with saying that I never really read that many reviews in the first place, because I've always thought that, if I'm going to review something, I'm going to try something myself, I don't want to bias myself. So that's kind of how I started and where I am today. And I'll just leave it at that.
I like what you said there about, the graphs are sort of supplementary to make it so that a reviewer isn't just like saying random things. Like they can actually hold up a thing and be like, look, what I'm talking about is at least within the ballpark of what this shows, right? I still think there's the big misstep as far as the community's understanding of that stuff, and probably still persists today, is this idea that like this is fixed performance of the product. That's what it is. And it's just, we know that that's not how this stuff works. I bet a lot of folks watching this right now probably still think that. But in light of all of that, I guess the question that I have for you guys, maybe we could start with Griffin, is how do you, I guess, approach your recommendations to a friend or somebody who might be getting into this space, or somebody's like, hey, I hear you're into headphones, how should I get into headphones? Other than just asking you your advice for what to get.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. Ultimately, it comes down to what kind of consumer they are. Like, I think it's important to recognize if you're giving, even if they're audiophile recommendations, most people don't want to go down the rabbit hole of being a everyday audiophile, like talking on the forums or the Discord servers. Most people just want to buy something that works for them and then, move on with their life. And I think something like the HD6XX is a great option for that, as is the HD600. There are probably a few other ones that could also satisfy based on the tastes of the person who wants to just buy that one thing. Like the Sony MDR MV1 is one that I think, if they want a more prominent bass and treble profile, but a similar kind of all-rounder energy to it, it does that similarly well to the 650 and 600, while obviously sounding quite different.
What do you guys think about the high-end versus the like more affordable or like attainable stuff? My perspective here is that there's been a lot more competence that we see, where a lot more general competence, whereas the stuff that's really expensive tends to be more specific, but also with a lot more risk involved, right? So you see a lot more sort of esoteric tunings. And I want to get your guys' thoughts on that.
I don't think a product necessarily has to be, some otherworldly tuned, extremely esoteric sounding thing. I think it just needs to be different enough that it invokes some sort of, I guess, emotion in the person who's considering making the purchase. And let's be real, the people who are looking to buy something that expensive have their mind set on, I want to buy something expensive, right? And this it's a bit of an excuse to say, yes, this hits what I'm looking for, and I can now spend the money on it. And that's not to invalidate any of that. I think if you have the money and you want to spend it and something speaks to you, right, buy it. But on the flip side of things, I think for most quote unquote normal people in the hobby, stuff at the lower end will probably suit your needs, right? I don't think there's anything, at least I haven't heard anything that's like so otherworldly good at the very high end that I'm like, you know, you should save all your pennies for this. Even the HE1, if it was at $20,000, I still wouldn't say, yeah, you know, save all your money for this kind of thing.
And also, you can bet that a lot of people who are buying products in the high end, if they were having those same experiences versus, you know, something that's a little bit more affordable or attainable, if they were in controlled environments or blind listening or anything like that, they wouldn't necessarily prefer the more expensive stuff, right?
I do think, you know, blind testing is a thing that probably should be done more, but not everybody wants to run a scientific experiment on themselves and they want to spend money.
No, my point was just that a lot of what goes into the awesome experiences that people report with various products, it's in part because of all the rest of the stuff around it that it becomes actually kind of difficult to, you know, figure out what is the report that holds up under scrutiny.
I think a lot of impressions and reviews are highly experiential. I don't think you should read them as a journalistic report that's like technical breakdowns of like, you know, XYZ. I think you should look at it as this person at this point in time is wanting to share their experience with something that they have passion about. And that's a good thing. I think it's fun to read that sort of thing. If you want to actually make a, you know, very rational purchase decision, you shouldn't take that as a, like I said, a journalistic report. You should take it as a highly personalized experiential anecdote and, you know, treat it for what it is, right?
This question is something I think about all the time, and I can't help but feel like what we're seeing in the audiophile sphere is a broad reflection of what we see in the wider global economic sphere. There's this increasing separation and stratification in this space between the things that most people can afford as far as products and the things that very small percentages of wealthy people can afford. And it's not only that the products themselves are being created with different philosophies, even though that is true, it's that the buyers themselves have different philosophies on what should be going into these products. And it's such that it's effectively created two separate markets that sell either headphones or IEMs both, but the value systems underpinning the creation and consumption of these products is so different. It's hard to really make the two congruent or feel like they belong together. Obviously, in the, I guess, more attainable price brackets, we've seen, a lot more focus on measurements, a lot more focus on targets, a lot more focus on value for money, all-rounderness. And in the high end, you don't really see much of that. The focus is more on making people excited, making people feel like they're getting something luxurious, and, marketing to reflect the need to inculcate that expectation in the person who may be potentially buying the earphone or a headphone. I do think if someone is jumping into the hobby now in the high end, I don't really think they have that much of an easier time than they did maybe 5 years ago. The products are more expensive, and I haven't seen the tunings really get all that different except for things like Storm now existing. Whereas for the buyer who's entering the more attainable price brackets now, it's a lot different than when we started, and I think a lot more generous to the consumer. There's a lot more decent stuff out there, and I think if you throw a rock and hit something and buy it, you're much less likely to get something that is outright terrible.
I think also there's a thing that happens when products get placed in the high end. It's almost as if, attaching a really high price tag or coming up with a product with the intention of placing it at a high price tag, in the minds of the manufacturers, maybe gives license for whatever tuning they happen to want to experiment with or say this is good. Whereas there's a stronger need for, general competence in more affordable or more attainable products, because otherwise they're just not competitive with all the other ones that are. In my view, that's kind of a shame, because years ago, this idea of I'm going to buy something nice for myself, it's going to be a headphone, I love music, I'm going to spend a bunch of money on getting a really nice headphone. You were kind of filtering out a lot of the bad options by doing that, or a lot of the like less than ideal options by doing that, and you could narrow your search down to the stuff that I think was maybe a little bit more good. Let's just say your experience would actually be genuinely good. Nowadays, I feel like, to your point, Griffin, it's a lot harder to be confident about that, and really the better experiences are not necessarily like that filtering idea, and the same way that you think about spending money in any other space kind of just doesn't apply to headphones. Like you're now just doing that for the sake of, as Caleb put it, having the experience of buying an expensive thing. It's not where we would have wanted that to go, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's actually kind of symptomatic of the fact that the hobby has grown overall. Like, yes, the more attainable price brackets have a lot more consumers now since 2020 or thereabouts, but the high-end market has also grown considerably. And it's interesting because prices have kind of ballooned in the high end. And what this has resulted in is manufacturers not needing to sell as many units to actually stay solvent. Like, if you're selling an IEM for $10,000, you don't need to sell that money to actually stay afloat. There will be a few buyers, but those few buyers are really all they need to stay relevant in that space. Whereas maybe a little bit earlier, if someone came out with, say, a $10,000 IEM, people probably would have been skeptical, and they might not have done as well as they do now with the current buyer's market.
I think that's the big improvement that we've seen. Like, we talk a little bit about how a lot of things can be a race to the bottom, and that is a little bit sort of informed by, increased focuses on measurements and that kind of thing. But overall, like, to what you guys are saying, like, the options that are available now versus 10 years ago, it's so much better in the affordable ranges, and even in the mid to slightly high end. Like, we're seeing a lot more great stuff come out that gives me a kind of optimism for people who, to your point, Griffin, aren't the cork sniffing losers and graph sniffers among us who spend our days on Discord and audio forums, right? Like, if you just want to get in and get out, have a great experience, and then enjoy your music, you have a much better shot of doing that today than you ever did before, right? So I have one more question for you guys. If you could choose a headphone, like a closed back headphone, an open back headphone, and an IEM today, what would you guys choose? So, like, we obviously cheat because we have like in-ear microphones and HRTFs, and like we have our preference testing, and we understand all this stuff in ways that a normal person should never have to do. So what I'm saying is, like, as far as like the things that you would target today, and how that's just different from the things that you targeted 10 years ago or 5 years ago or whenever you got into it.
Okay, I think for IEM, so honestly, I'm gonna show the Moondrop Robin again because it's wireless. It's wireless. The ANC is good enough. The sound is good enough, and that's all I care about. Frankly, that's what I bring whenever I travel anywhere nowadays. It's my everyday carry. For headphone, I think my thought process between like headphones or just audio gear in general hasn't really changed that much. If I was starting, it was a brand new in the hobby, and I was just starting. Despite the fact that I don't think the HD like 600 or 6XS are like the perfect headphones, they are such like milestone products that you kind of have to have it just to understand the contextual aspect of this whole hobby, right? The HD 600 is still what I would probably get, a Marble Edition, of course. I'm gonna throw something out here, which is the HD 480 Pro, the one that you were, you were just shilling. I actually haven't heard it. But based on what it sounds like this will also be like a pretty, landmark product. And I think that for me, my thought process behind buying this sort of thing is to buy the thing that everybody says is good enough, and then I can learn from it and move from there. So that's how I would approach it.
Yeah, so thinking about my actual constraints and needs when it comes to headphones, it would actually be pretty simple, but I would be targeting comfort fairly highly, which I wasn't really thinking about when I was first buying headphones. So for closed back, it's pretty easy. It's one of the best headphones I've heard or used. It's the Sennheiser HD 480 Pro. I still use that thing all the time, every day, basically. It's just a great sounding, well engineered and built and comfortable headphone. For open backs, again, we're within my budget, which is not huge, so I would probably go for the Hi-Fi Man Edition XV. Nice comfort on my head with the capper strap I have on it at least, and really roomy, spacious cups, nice acoustic openness. Could EQ it a little bit, but if I just want to throw on an open back headphone and listen, it's one of the ones that bothers me the least. And then for the IEM, it'd be the Crinier Reference. Again, not perfect, a little bit lean, a little bit detached between bass and mid-range, but smooth treble, reasonable fit, not a crazy price.
I've been sort of thinking about this one. For the closed back option, it's the same as what you said, Griff. It would be the HD 480 Pro. Caleb, you said the 480 Pro as well, right?
Yeah, I did, even though I haven't heard it.
So, and for all the same reasons. So yeah, I would go HD 480 Pro. For the open back, this is more of a challenge because, like, you know, if I had lots of money, I would probably choose something like a D1, right? But because I don't, it's actually going to go to the Aoun AR3000, which I have on my desk here, but it's not released yet. It's just a prototype, so.
Why do you guys keep picking things that aren't released, man? You're gonna get so many angry comments. Like, oh my god, it's not released.
Here's the thing though. Okay, I know it's not released, but it uses the same kind of ergonomic design or like the comfort is pretty similar to like the AR5000, and the AR5000 is very comfortable for me. And I, like what you guys said, I think that's the biggest change for me buying headphones or getting headphones now versus like when I first started, is comfort is so much more important to me. And this is a very comfortable platform. So it'd be this or something like it. And then for an IEM, I think I would actually go Crinier Daybreak and not the Reference. Like the value proposition on the Daybreak is just so much better. Like I like the Reference better, but it's quite a bit more expensive than the Daybreak, and IEMs are, if I have a closed back headphone, I'm not going to use IEMs all the time, right? I'm going to use IEMs when I'm traveling or something like that. You know what I mean? So I don't feel like my listening experience needs to be with an IEM, and the Daybreak is close enough to being exactly what I like that I would be happy with it. I think that's going to do it for our thoughts. Do we have any final thoughts on this topic?
I think the thing that would be probably most useful to people is to kind of summarize what's changed as we've learned more about this hobby and been in it for a while. And it seems like something that's been a unilateral change for all three of us, at least, is that we care more about comfort than we did when we started. So if you're just getting into this, I would recommend thinking seriously about the headphones you have already, or the IEMs or earbuds you have already, and thinking about if they're actually comfortable for you, thinking about if some other sort of design would be better for you. But also, we all, I think, agree that price isn't linearly correlated to sound quality. So if you're one of those people who thinks you need to spend a lot of money to get something excellent, that's not the case. So definitely consider things that are either strictly within your budget or even below your budget if you are thinking about accommodating as many products as possible to see which one will ultimately be best for you. There's nothing really that would say that that thing will be in the high end. You can really find the best product for you in any price bracket.
Okay, and that's going to do it for this video. As always, if you guys want to support what we do here, check out headphones.com. But one of the ways that we fund the channel here is through the YouTube memberships. So if you want to buy us a coffee and hang out with us during live streams, that's what the YouTube memberships are for. And this also allows us to purchase other equipment for review that we otherwise wouldn't have a chance to do. So big thanks to you guys for supporting us. And also big shout out to everybody who has followed us on our journey here. We're at 250,000 subscribers by the time you guys are watching this. So big thumbs up to everybody who is here as a subscriber. And if you were not a subscriber, now would be a great time to do so because we're only going to keep going. Until next time, we'll see you guys later. Bye for now.
Bye, guys.